I know that this is Professor Firuz Kazemzadeh's first visit to Ireland, and it really, he and his wife do us and the people of Ireland great honour by visiting us. If you hear a Russian accent, it is because he was born in Moscow and went to Iran for a few years and then went to the United States in, as far as I remember, 1943. And in 1963, he was elected to the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States of America, and apart from 2 years when he left the States, he has been on the National Assembly since then. And as he said himself, legend has it that he was put on the National Assembly at the time of Mullah Hussein Ibushru'i. I'm sure he's got many years left in him still. He is a very distinguished professor. He's a professor of Eastern Studies, has written many books, and maybe most of us will recognize him from the beautiful talk he gave on the beloved Master Abdu'l-Baha at the Second Baha'i World Congress in 1992. Tonight he's going to talk about the father of Abdu'l-Baha, the Blessed Beauty, Bahá'u'lláh. So please could we give a welcome to Professor Kazemzadeh.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I must confess that I am not very comfortable with giving this talk. Not because I haven't given talks before. I spent 40 years of my life teaching at the university, but because talking about Bahá'u'lláh to a Baha'i audience is very difficult. You already know a great deal about Bahá'u'lláh, and therefore to give you a very superficial survey would be virtually useless. In fact, it might even annoy you. On the other hand, to concentrate on some little episode, some particular event in Bahá'u'llah's life, would not be giving a talk about Bahá'u'lláh. And so one is caught in this dilemma of an audience which is already enlightened, knows a lot, and how to present something to this audience which would be at least a little bit useful. Now, in thinking of what to do, I decided to sort of divide my talk into two parts. One, to deal with the outline of Bahá'u'llah's life on this earth. The other one, which is much more difficult to pull off, is to talk about the inner or the spiritual life of Bahá'u'lláh, which of course is a closed book to us except when he wishes to reveal it to us in his writings. And yet without that second element, the life of Bahá'u'lláh becomes only a life of an outstanding individual. It is his spiritual life that validates the events of his earthly existence. Now, Bahá'u'lláh was one of those rare individuals who appear perhaps once every 1,000 years. Our recorded history doesn't go much beyond 6,000 years, but from the very beginning, we have these, at first, shadowy figures without much records. Who was Adam? We talk about the first man, the first manifestation of God, somebody who was the first to talk with God under whatever circumstances. Abraham, Krishna, these are almost nothing but names somehow preserved in the memory of humanity. Then gradually we learn more. We have much more information about, let us say, Moses who brings the law, about Jesus who offers salvation, about empire-building manifestations of God like Zoroaster and Muhammad. But we see that every one of them is a founder of a great civilization and a guide and inspirer of mankind. We also learn very rapidly, very quickly, that these individuals seem to know and understand the essence of things, but we are never capable of understanding their essence. The relationship there seems to be one-sided. They come to us, they teach us, but they remain mysteries of God to the end. Now we are very fortunate because we live only some 106 years removed from the latest manifestation of God, Bahá'u'lláh. In fact, I myself have known at least half a dozen individuals who personally met and knew Bahá'u'lláh. And that, of course, is a rare thing. Has anyone here met anyone who talked to Bahá'u'lláh? Well, you see, there are some people here. I remember listening to a man, Haji Ali, in Haifa in 1941. He was then 103 years old. And he remembered Bahá'u'lláh not as an old man, but Bahá'u'lláh in his full vigor. And to sit there and listen to him was so fascinating. And then Shoghi Effendi told the pilgrims, he said, listen to this man, because his memory is perfect. So here was an experience. Can you imagine meeting somebody and talking to somebody who talked to Christ or to Muhammad? First-hand information coming from a man who was there. Or hand of the cause Samandari, who, as I was recounting only yesterday, talked about an incident in his life when he was only 8 years old, where he was committing, what shall we say, a minor crime, and found Bahá'u'lláh to be his accomplice. He was 8 years old at Bahji, at the mansion, and running around, he saw a door open to the basement. He looked in, and to his great delight, discovered a barrel of sugar lumps. So he put his hand there and took a lump of sugar, and then he noticed that the place darkened. Somebody was standing in that narrow doorway. He looked around, and behind him stood Bahá'u'lláh. Now, at the age of 8, he knew who Bahá'u'lláh was. He was petrified. And Bahá'u'lláh said, shh, and put his blessed hand into that barrel and took a few more lumps of sugar and put them in Samandari's hand and tell him, get out of here. Now, can you imagine in one's own lifetime to meet people like this? It is so fresh. It is with us. Now, Bahá'u'lláh, therefore, is not a remote figure. Moreover, of all the prophets of God, he, even to a much greater extent than the Bab, had his life recorded very well. You see, the Bab came from a merchant family. It was not a prominent family. We know very little about his father, the rest of the family. But Bahá'u'lláh was born in a noble family of Iran. His father was at the court, a friend of one of the great prime ministers of the early Qajar Iran, a man by the name of Qaim Maqam, who was also a famous writer who had a circle of intellectuals gathered around him. So Bahá'u'lláh moved in circles like that. People who were highly literate, people who recorded things, and so we have a great deal of information about Bahá'u'lláh. However, the information which we obtained is not really sufficient without the light that Bahá'u'lláh himself throws on his life and the interpretation which he gives to it, to which I will come later. Now, when Bahá'u'lláh died in Akka in 1892, the world at large really took no notice. In Iran, in those circles in which he was known, it was noted, of course, including at the court of the Shah and among the nobility. But By that time, of course, he had been in exile for many years. He had many enemies. And the only people who grieved for him were Baha'is who lived in a semi-underground, in a situation very much like the situation of the Baha'is in Iran today, and a few scattered groups of Baha'is in Central Asia, in the Caucasus, in India, and in Burma, and in a few spots within the Ottoman Empire. As in the case of Jesus, there were no, what shall we say, press reports. There was nothing on television, nothing on the radio. The world kept going its own way, and yet something momentous had happened from the middle of the 19th century to the time that Baha'u'lláh passed away. Now, 100 years later, things have changed very much. Wilma attended a couple of years ago the second meeting of a World Parliament of Religions. The first one was held in Chicago in 1893. And this was the first time that the name of Baha'u'lláh was mentioned in public in the Western Hemisphere. But how was it mentioned? A Christian missionary talked about a Persian sage who had passed away the year before in Syria and gave a very, very sketchy report of what this was all about. 100 years later, in New York, the Baha'is commemorated the 100th anniversary of the passing of Baha'u'lláh. There were 30,000 people there. And some of you may have been there and saw that magnificent event. And it was in the New York Times, and it was on the radio, and the world took notice only 100 years later. And today, more than 5 million adherents spread throughout the world celebrate Baha'u'lláh, talk about him, are inspired by him. His writings have been translated into hundreds of languages. Temples are built on every continent of the globe to his glory. And his ideas are shaping the world even when the world doesn't know about it. And perhaps that in itself is a proof and a test of the validity of a message of a manifestation of God. That he can influence people without people knowing that they are being influenced. That the whole world changes course, moves in unforeseen and new directions because of the exercise of his invisible will. Now, let us talk for a few minutes about the man, about the outward facts of his life. He was born in Tehran, November 1817. I already mentioned that his was a very noble and ancient family from Mazandaran, from northern Iran. His father had held many important positions in government and at court. The family had great connections. At one point, the Prime Minister, Mirza Khan Nouri, was the husband of one of Baha'u'llah's cousins. In other words, Baha'u'lláh was not somebody who was from the periphery of Iranian life. He came from the center of it. And yet, he was not part of that establishment. And this was felt from the very beginning. For instance, his father, a highly learned, very wealthy gentleman who had great concerns for education, told the teachers, leave the boy alone. Somehow there was a feeling that you really didn't have to teach him. He displayed some strange qualities that surprised people. I almost said delighted, but that would not be the right word. I suspect that they intimidated people. You probably all heard the story of his older brother's wedding, where according to the old Persian custom, or Persian custom in the noble families, for the children there was a puppet show. and children loved these puppet shows. So Baha'u'lláh was there with the other children, watched the show, and when the show, which included kings and queens and champions, when the show was over, Baha'u'lláh went behind the stage and saw the puppeteer flatten out the puppets and put them in a box. And this little boy commented, "Isn't this how the world is? That at the end of their careers, of their doings, kings and queens and important people end up flat in a box?" So already at that age, he saw other things than little children will normally see. From his earliest youth, Baha'u'lláh specifies that the age of spiritual maturity is 15, but it seems that Baha'u'lláh at the age of 15 was mature politically and legally as well, because his father found himself in grievous troubles. His father, in accordance with the customs of the day, of course, in Islam, had several wives. One of these was a sister of the Shah. And while it may have been a great honor, it was also a great liability, because a sister of the Shah, you all heard about the low status of women in Islam. Not if you were a sister of the Shah. Then you were untouchable, because you could go and complain to your brother, and you know what would happen. Indeed, this was the situation in Baha'u'llah's father's household. He had a falling out with his wife, and lo and behold, she got a divorce and demanded all the properties, and had Baha'u'llah's father, Mirza Bozorg, put in jail. And so here was Baha'u'lláh, about 15 years old, going from government office to government office, exploiting these old connections and friendships, trying to recover something of his father's properties in order to feed a rather large family. And to a large extent, he succeeded. The father's house in Tehran, a beautiful building which still stands, and fortunately, these barbarians of the Iranian Revolution have not destroyed it the way that they have destroyed the house of the Bab in Shiraz. So here was a practical matter where Baha'u'lláh had to deal with legal matters, with politicians, with powerful people in his town, a boy of 15. And yet he had no hesitation. He acquitted himself brilliantly in this case. But these were not his main interests. And while people expected that he would follow his father and enter government service, his heart was elsewhere. He engaged himself in charitable work and soon became known as the father of the poor in Tehran. He loved to participate in learned discussions with both with the clergy and with educated laymen. But most of all, people sensed that there was an expectation about him, as if he were waiting for something. That something was a visit from a man who brought a tablet from the Bab. Baha'u'lláh took one look and then turned to his younger brother, Mirza Musa, and said, "Look at this, what do you think?" And before he heard an answer from his younger brother, he says, "This is from God." And he became a follower of the Bab. But when you say a follower, you get an image. Who is a follower? A follower is he who follows. And in a sense, Baha'u'lláh did follow. He followed in a very interesting way. He actually didn't so much follow as he guided the other followers. Very soon, he became a center of a group of leading Babis who not only spread the faith, but also gave it shape and form. He interpreted the meanings of the Bab's writings to the other Babis. He was the person who rented the gardens at Badasht and almost as a stage director, organized that event. And that event was of momentous importance because that was the conscious break that the Babis made with Islam. That's when the new religion starts for the people. For the Bab, of course, it starts with his own revelation. But the first couple of years of among the Babis, there was not yet the realization that this is a new manifestation of God. This was the promised one from the family of Muhammad. This was a fulfillment of Islamic prophecies. These people were Muslims who have found a spiritual guide. At Badasht, they learned that this was not Islam anymore, that a new law had come, that a new manifestation had appeared on earth. And that event, as I said, was managed behind the scenes by Bahá'u'lláh. Because of this, he became known to the government as a Babi leader and obviously was placed in immediate danger as soon as the government began to persecute the Babis. And then, in the early fall of 1853, 3 Babis, crazed by their grief after the martyrdom of the Bab, decided to kill the Shah. They were not professional killers. They were extremely incompetent. Can you imagine? They loaded their pistols with birdshot. Now, how do you expect to kill anybody with that? But they tried, and as a result, there was a savage persecution, and there were murders of Babis all over the country, and Bahá'u'lláh was thrown into the Siyah-Chal, into that terrible jail. By the way, an interesting point here is that Bahá'u'lláh happened to be with a relative of his who was a dragoman of the Russian legation in Tehran, in a little village called Zargandeh, north of Tehran, a village which was off limits to the Persians, which was extraterritorially protected. And so Bahá'u'lláh was safe there. But when he heard that the government was looking for him, he left that village and himself went to Niavaran, where the Shah had his summer camp, and surrendered himself to the authorities. Now, there is an interesting story connected with that, because the word was spread and a story appeared in the government gazette, which was an official publication in Iran, stating that the Russian minister to Iran, Prince Dolgorukov, had surrendered Bahá'u'lláh and conveyed him under guard to the Iranian authorities. Dolgorukov, the Russian ambassador, was a powerful figure. He belonged to the highest Russian nobility. In fact, his family was more ancient than the family of the Tsar. And so when Dolgorukov read this report in the Tehran newspaper, he was infuriated. He took this as an insult. He had not surrendered Bahá'u'lláh. Bahá'u'lláh left on his own. And so Dolgorukov immediately demanded a retraction by the Iranian government. Now this, of course, was not something that the Iranian government wanted to do because they had made this official statement. But Dolgorukov, as I said, was a powerful individual, and he was willing to get into a fight with the Iranian Minister of Foreign Affairs, and so a semi-retraction was published. In any case, Bahá'u'lláh was now in the Siyah-Chal. Now the same Dolgorukov helped a great deal to save Bahá'u'llah's life and to make it possible for him to leave the country. We don't have time, nor is this the place to go into details, some of which are very fascinating. Let me just tell you, simply because I can't help myself and have to tell you, because in the Russian Foreign Ministry archives in 1990, I came across the original papers that have to do with this incident. And Dolgorukov, of course, protested to the Iranian government in rather rough terms. The Minister of Foreign Affairs of Iran was offended and went to the Shah and said, "What is this? We have a prisoner here, and the Russian ambassador interferes in our domestic affairs, and he uses strong language, and he insults me." Shah got insulted too. And he said, "Tell our ambassador in St. Petersburg to complain to the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs about the behavior of their representative in Tehran." And this was done. Now, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Prince Gorchakov, writes a report to the Tsar. And this is the report that I read with great interest in the original. And the report says, "Your Majesty, the Persian ambassador visited me, and he was very upset by the behavior of Prince Dolgorukov in Tehran. Prince Dolgorukov used inadmissible language, he displayed anger which is out of place, etc., etc. And I would like to have guidance from your Imperial Majesty as to how to deal with the situation." In the margin, in the hand of the Tsar, it is written, "If I know my Dolgorukov, he is capable of acting like that." So we have confirmation that he was very emphatic. But this was not the only cause of Baha'u'llah's life being saved. It was also helped by the Prime Minister, who, as I said, was married to a cousin of Baha'u'llah's, came from the same area of Mazandaran, and while he did not like the Babis, he was very sorry that Baha'u'llah was one. Family ties in Iran in those days were very strong, and one defended one's own, even if one's own was a heretic and was placed in jail. And so Baha'u'llah was not executed with the other Babis, with the majority of the Babi leaders in that bloody year, but he was exiled. First to Baghdad, and then to Constantinople and Adrianople, and finally to Akka. And at each one of these spots, events occurred which gradually revealed to those who were around Baha'u'llah his station, his extraordinary personality. There are family memories that those of us who had ancestors who lived in those days cherish very much. My great-grandfather was one of those Babis in the early days who believed, as most Babis believed, that the leader of the Babi community after 1853, after 1850, after the martyrdom of the Bab, that the leader of the community was Azal, and the unworthy brother of Baha'u'llah. He was the person that was supposed to be in charge, so to speak. And so my great-grandfather, who lived in Isfahan, and who saw the massacres and the disappearance of Babi leadership, because so many of them had been killed, knew that Azal and his brother, Baha, were in Baghdad. And so he decided to go to Baghdad to meet Azal, to ask for directions, to be guided. He arrived in Baghdad and he met Azal, and his disappointment was terrible. This man was concerned with nothing but himself. He didn't seem to be even very intelligent. His conversation was empty, and most of all, he didn't want to be seen. He didn't want to be accused of being a leader. He was sort of in semi-hiding. And so my great-grandfather then went to meet Baha. And what a contrast. Here was something completely different. Here was a person who had not yet made a claim to divine revelation, who was open, who was welcoming, who resolved his perplexities. But then when Baha'u'llah asked my great-grandfather, "Have you met Azal?" And my great-grandfather said, "Sir, I was not favorably impressed." Baha'u'llah said, be quiet. It is not up to you to pass such judgments. So he remained quiet. But for him, there was absolutely no doubt who mattered and who did not. And this, I'm simply using this little episode as an example of what was happening in the Baha'i community even before Baha'u'lláh declared his mission. More and more Baha'i individuals who passed through Baghdad, who met Baha'u'lláh, instinctively felt that he really was their leader. And then, of course, you all know about the difficulties that Baha'u'lláh sustained there, his leaving for the mountains of Kurdistan, his eventual return. But while this is very well known, sometimes we omit or forget the more human side of Baha'u'llah's life in Baghdad. For instance, the fact that he loved to go to the coffee houses and that he would engage in discussions on philosophical and religious themes while sipping coffee with important individuals in the city of Baghdad. You know, sometimes for us it's difficult to put together these two elements. Here is a manifestation of God, but then you can find him in the coffee shop. But that's how it went, you see. This was the reality. Now, this brings me back to this notion of the duality of his mission. One is this life that includes coffee shops, includes imprisonment, includes exile. The other is what is happening within, and that we don't know by observation, but we know some of it because he revealed it to us. The twofold nature of his mission, of course, he stated for us himself. He said that he came to make us know and worship God, that is on a spiritual plane, and on earth to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. Now let's take a look at this very briefly. The knowledge of God. Baha'u'lláh states clearly that it is impossible to know God directly, and indeed every attempt that anybody has ever made to know God directly has come to nothing. If people read the writings, the sacred scriptures of earlier religions, they would have known it anyway. For instance, where does Abraham hear the voice of God? In a burning bush. He doesn't see God face to face. The burning bush, the fire, and by the way, you can see how this also reflects itself in the Zoroastrian attitude toward fire. Fire with its motion, with its heat, fire being alive, represents the divine in many religions. And so the bush is burning and it does not burn down. And out of that burning bush comes the word of God. Or Moses and the Sinaitic revelation, where he hears the words of God. The Christians struggled mightily to understand the nature of God and of revelation, and got themselves into impossible philosophical positions. Played with the notions of Trinity, the two natures of Jesus, what is divine and what is human. But you see, they were not completely off the track, because they instinctively felt that Jesus was not just a man. There was something else. They never found the language to express what was there. Muhammad talks about revelation being brought to him by the archangel Gabriel, obviously a poetic figure. Even Baha'u'lláh talks about the maid of heaven. But Baha'u'lláh makes it explicit that these are poetic terms which signify two things: the impossibility of direct knowledge, but the possibility of knowing about God through his manifestations. That is the meaning of the, let's say, two natures of Christ. That is the meaning of the manifestation of God. Baha'u'lláh makes it very clear in the Iran. He says, to every discriminating and illuminated heart, it is evident that God, the unknowable essence, the divine being, is immeasurably exalted above every human attribute, such as corporeal existence, ascent and descent, egress and regress. He is and has ever been veiled in the ancient eternity of his essence, and will remain in his reality, everlastingly hidden from the eyes of men. Now, this could almost bring you to agnosticism, right? He is veiled, you cannot know him, he gives you no sign, therefore what are we going to be? Agnostics. We don't deny his existence, but we cannot say anything about him. But then, the next paragraph, Baha'u'lláh says, the door of the knowledge of the Ancient of Days, being thus closed in the face of all beings, the source of infinite grace hath caused those luminous gems of holiness to appear out of the realm of the spirit in the form of the human temple, and to be made manifest unto all men, that they may impart unto the world the mysteries of his unchangeable being, and tell of the subtleties of his imperishable essence. And so here is the end of the agnosticism, right? Here is a statement that while we cannot know the essence of God, while we will never see the face of God, we do have a direct connection through the manifestations, these luminous beings, these gems of holiness who appear among us and carry with them the Spirit of God. In effect, knowing God's manifestation, as far as we are concerned, from our plane, is the equivalent of knowing God. And again, this was known a long time ago in other religions, even though the members of other religions were never able to state it clearly or to understand it completely. For instance, Martin Buber, a Jewish scholar and philosopher, has pointed out in his book on Moses that he had long been baffled by the Christian insistence that Jesus was God. Now, was Moses then God too? The Jews have not made that claim. And then Buber came across a passage in the Old Testament, a fascinating passage, where it says that God talked to Moses and said, go and tell the people thus and so. And Moses begins to argue with God and says, sir, I can't go and tell the people. I'm a stutterer. They won't listen to me. And God turns around and says, you go and tell your brother Aaron to tell the people. And here is that sentence. And you will be Aaron's God as I am your God. So you see, Moses for Aaron, for an ordinary human being, is God. For Moses, he is not God. God is above. So you see, this is what a manifestation is. For us, there really is no difference. Jesus says that he is the Alpha and Omega. There is no other way to God except through him. That means the same thing. The only way that we know God is through the manifestation. And so the manifestation, if anybody says he is God, he is not God in a kind of a philosophical, metaphysical sense. But from where we stand, he is the equivalent. That is the only source from which we know God. And Baha'u'lláh again continues. He says, as a token of his mercy, He hath manifested unto men the day stars of his divine guidance, the symbols of his divine unity, and hath ordained the knowledge of these sanctified beings to be identical with the knowledge of his own self. Now let me repeat this, because this is really the crux of the matter. This is who Bahá'u'lláh is. God then manifested unto men the day stars of his divine guidance, individuals, symbols of his divine unity, and hath ordained the knowledge of these sanctified beings to be identical with the knowledge of his own self. So if you know these sanctified beings, if you know Moses, if you know Jesus, if you know Muhammad, if you know Bahá'u'lláh, that is the equivalent, it says, to be identical with the knowledge of his own self. Now that, of course, raises these divine manifestations to divine status when we look at them from below. That is who they are. And Bahá'u'lláh then continues and says, whoso recognizes them hath recognized God. Every one of them is the way to God that connecteth this world with the realm above. They are the manifestations of God amidst men, the evidences of his truth and the signs of his glory. Each one of these manifestations increases our knowledge of God, gives us more information, more aspects. But of course, to know more about the infinite is the equivalent of knowing nothing. And here are these wonderful spiritual paradoxes that as you accumulate more and more knowledge, you realize how little you know, how little you are capable of knowing. It is an infinite process of approaching. We have just heard this beautiful reading from the Seven Valleys. You begin with a search. The more you search, the farther away you are. However, in the process you have become enriched and you have made connections with the source of all knowledge. And so the Baha'is believe that Bahá'u'lláh and the prophets before him, and again I quote, have all as the channels of God's grace, as the exponents of his unity, as mirrors of his light and the revealers of his purpose, been commissioned to unfold to mankind an ever-increasing measure of his truth, of his inscrutable will and divine guidance, and will continue to the end that hath no end, to vouchsafe still fuller and mightier revelations of his limitless power and glory. Now, one can make all kinds of distinctions between a manifestation and a philosopher as far as the life of humanity is concerned. People will say, well, isn't Bahá'u'lláh significant because he brought certain ideas? Yes, indeed, but other people have brought ideas. In fact, Bahá'u'lláh sometimes expressed himself through ideas which he borrowed from ordinary human beings. He will quote Plato, he will quote Persian poets. So why do we Baha'is claim that he is qualitatively different from all of them, that he does not belong in the same category? Let me tell you an old Persian story about a great Persian Muslim philosopher, Avicenna, Abu Ali ibn Sina in Arabic, in Persian. Avicenna was a great man. He was a mathematician, and it was hundreds of years ago that he lived and died. I mean, why do we have to bother with him? You are here now. You know all of these wonderful things. Why don't you proclaim yourself to be a prophet of God? And Avicenna said, well, I don't have time for these discussions right now. Later. Sometime later, Avicenna was ill. He had fever. In the middle of the night, he wanted a drink of water. His student was sleeping in the same room. So Avicenna called him and said, would you please go out and bring me a cup of water? And it was bitter cold outside. And the bed was warm and comfortable. And the student didn't want to go. And he said, teacher, didn't you tell us that if a person has fever, he shouldn't drink in the middle of the night or something like that? And Avicenna asked him again, said, look, I know better. It's perfectly all right in my condition to have a drink of water. Again, the student gave him some silly answer, turned to the wall, and slept. A couple of hours later, just before dawn, about a mile away on a minaret, a muezzin, a prayer crier, shouted, Allahu Akbar, God is great, calling people to prayer. This student jumped out of bed, ran out into the cold, broke the ice in a pool, performed his ablution with ice water, prayed, and came back. Avicenna said, come here. I am the mathematician, the physician, the philosopher, the great one. I am here in the room with you. I ask you to get me a glass of water. You don't. Some Arab camel driver, hundreds of miles away 400 years ago, who didn't speak your language and who was illiterate, gave you some commandment, and look how you jump out of bed. That's why I'm not a prophet. Now this is a very important distinction. The words of a manifestation, the words of a prophet, they carry in them a certain power that is not just ordinary human power. This is why in our own Baha'i activities, we cannot simply rely on our own plans, even if they are systematization or whatever latest term we use. None of these plans are going to get us any place unless we are infused with the Spirit, which made that disciple jump out of bed on a cold night. Now, to know and to worship God is the purpose that the manifestation comes for, to help us to know God and to worship Him. But also Baha'u'lláh says to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. This second element of Baha'u'llah's mission was really to spiritualize and to sanctify life. Now that also is not something new. All religion does that. But in this dispensation, that statement is made by Baha'u'lláh himself on many occasions, much more clearly, much more definitely. Now what is being spiritualized? Everything. Attitudes toward material things, attitudes toward sexual relations, attitudes toward the bringing up of children, attitudes toward the management of business, attitudes toward government and political matters. Every one of these is supposed to be and will be touched by divine inspiration, and therefore become something else than a simple material or selfish activity. Baha'u'lláh tells us about detachment, and you have heard this morning some very eloquent statements about detachment. But one must not lose balance, because detachment in a certain very interesting way does not lead a Baha'i away from the world, does not lead him to abandon this world. On the contrary, it is only when one becomes truly detached and puts Baha'u'lláh in the center of one's being that one can turn back to the world, return to the world, and work in the world in order to advance that civilization. Baha'is are not against good food. Baha'u'lláh permitted it. He said that on the day of Rizwan, all foods, all prohibitions against eating various foods have been lifted. Food has become sanctified. Now, obviously, under certain rules, one shouldn't overeat. One shouldn't eat too much fat and meat in one's youth and in an old age suffer coronary problems like some of us do. But the principle is still there. It is not the rejection of the material life. Baha'u'lláh says, dress in silks and velvets, provided that none of this diverts one from what is at the center of a Baha'i's life. So here in the Baha'i faith there is a balance created. The spiritualization of all life, not asceticism, not Puritanism, but the fullness of life which is illumined and guided by divine spirit. Baha'u'lláh says, all men have been created to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. The Almighty beareth me witness, to act like the beasts of the field is unworthy of man. Those virtues that befit his dignity are forbearance, mercy, compassion, and loving kindness toward all the peoples and kindreds of the earth. Baha'u'lláh sacrificed everything. He sacrificed wealth, position, friendships. If you read the fire tablet, when he talks about being a stranger among the Syrians, it's enough to break your heart. And in this conversation that he has with God, which is the most amazing, I think, in all religious history, he in fact triumphs because while at first, you remember the story of Jesus. In the garden before crucifixion, he cries out to God exactly in the same way as Baha'u'lláh cried out to God. And he heard no answer. But Baha'u'lláh hears an answer. And the answer is triumph. And this again is an aspect of the Baha'i faith which we must never forget. But what was the purpose then of all this sacrifice? He accepted his miseries. He lost his wealth, position, homeland. He accepted jail, torture, exile, rejection, betrayal, poison, you name it. This was his lot. Yet he never wavered. Why? For what purpose? And the purpose was to build a new world. To build a new world and to bring freedom and joy. The ancient beauty has consented to be found with chains, that mankind may be released from its bondage, and has accepted to be made a prisoner, that the whole world may attain to true liberty. He has drained to its dregs the cup of sorrow, that all the people of the earth may attain unto abiding joy and be filled with gladness. Now Baha'u'llah's mission has uncounted and unimaginable consequences. It is too early for us even to make estimates. The inner perfectioning of man is something which will take a long, long time. But the road is clear. The road to that inner perfectioning consists, and again you heard it this morning, expressed so eloquently, prayer, meditation, fasting, the Bahá'u'lláh. Every one of these was mentioned this morning, and I swear that I had these notes written before I came to the summer school. So you see the coincidence of our thinking. When you are a Baha'i and you look in the writings, this is what you get, whether you are studying the faith in America or in Ireland or wherever. These are the qualities. The cultivation of moral qualities, the cultivation of attitudes of psychological sets of mind without which nothing else can be achieved. And again, I will quote to you a passage which some of you probably know by heart. Baha'u'lláh says, be generous in prosperity and thankful in adversity. Be worthy of the trust of thy neighbor and look upon him with a bright, and friendly face. Be a treasure to the poor, an admonisher to the rich, an answerer of the cry of the needy, a preserver of the sanctity of thy pledge. Be fair in thy judgment and guarded in thy speech. Be unjust to no man and show all meekness to all men. Let integrity and uprightness distinguish all thine acts. Be a home to the stranger, a balm to the suffering, a tower of strength to the fugitive. Now these are the qualities that the Baha'is must cultivate, and only those who have embarked upon the voyage of self-transformation and perfection can establish this inner connection with Baha'u'lláh and build his kingdom on earth. Now, you might say, this was about Baha'u'llah's teachings. What about Baha'u'lláh? How can you separate the two? Baha'u'lláh, the person, and Baha'u'lláh, the manifestation of God, and his word and his teachings ultimately are one. And I think I have taken up all my time now. Comments, questions? More stories. Anybody? Yes.
I'd like to ask the name of, if you don't mind, the name of your great-grandfather.
His name was Haj Muhammad Kazem. He had another experience with Baha'u'lláh and Azal. He was there in 1863, when the order came from the Ottoman government to take Baha'u'lláh or for Baha'u'lláh to come to Constantinople. And Baha'u'lláh one day turned in a group where Azal was present, turned to Azal and said, "You should go to Iran because you were not exiled." And indeed, you see, Azal had never been arrested or exiled. You can return to Iran and try to revive the Babi community, which was in a very bad shape. And Azal, who was a coward, said, "Well, my passport has expired, and if I go to the Iranian consulate, they might seize me or do something to me." Baha'u'lláh turned to this Haj Muhammad Kazem and said, "You look like Janab Azal. Why don't you take his passport to the Iranian consulate and get it prolonged?" So my honorable ancestor did this, and then when he came back, he said to Baha'u'lláh, "Please don't ask me to deal with that man anymore." And once again he was admonished by Baha'u'lláh that it is not up to you to pass such judgments. There are no other questions. So you should have prearranged that.
I made a mistake.
In the old American vaudeville, they had the shills, these people who were by prearrangement, they would applaud, and
What are they called?
they were called shills.
Shills.
Yes.
I'm sure there's a few shills here. Come on. There's one.
There's one. Is that inbounds or out of bounds? Well, in Russia, actually, if you, by Russia means the Russian Empire, it's one thing. If you mean Russia proper, because you see there is a terminological confusion. Nobody ever confused India with England, but everybody confuses, let's say, Azerbaijan or Turkmenistan with Russia. Because these territories were contiguous and there was no ocean between them. People say, the first Baha'i temple was built in Russia. Well, it is as if you said that the first Baha'is to go to England went there in the time of Baha'u'lláh, because they went to India and to Burma. You see. So in Central Asia, the Baha'i faith was introduced very early. In fact, the Russians conquered that area in 1881, and just a few years later, at Bahá'u'llah's urging, a group of Iranian Baha'is went into that area and in the newly founded town of Ashkhabad established a small Baha'i community. That community grew quite rapidly, and by the time of the Russian Revolution, by 1917, 1918, they had the first Baha'i temple erected, and they had dependencies. They had a school for boys, a school for girls, they had an orphanage, they published a newspaper, and the number of Baha'is in a town of under 50,000 was 4,000. So it was a sizable community, a prosperous community, and this was the place where for the first time in Baha'i history, a true Baha'i community life was developing. But then came the Bolshevik Revolution, and the pressure was brought to bear on this Baha'i community. In 1929, the Soviet government expropriated the temple, and then in the 1930s, the reign of terror began, and most of the Baha'is either were exiled to Iran or ended up in concentration camps in northern Kazakhstan and in Siberia, and it looked as if the Baha'i community had been completely extinguished. It was wonderful to behold how so many years later, more than 50 years later, once the communist regime collapsed, children and grandchildren of those Baha'is still had preserved their Baha'i identity. Many of them didn't know much about the teachings, but at heart, they were Baha'is. Now, as far as Russia proper was concerned, that is, that part of the empire, the metropolitan part of the empire, where people speak Russian and are Russians, the faith didn't have much of an impact on Russia. There were very few Baha'is who were Russians. My own mother was one, but I cannot remember more than half a dozen. I wouldn't be surprised if a best count would reveal, 10, 15 Russian Baha'is in those days. However, Russian Orientalists, Russian scholars were very much interested in the faith. The first translation of the Aqdas into any language was made by a certain Tumansky, a Russian Orientalist. Several other Russian Orientalist students of Islam worked on the Babi and the Baha'i faith and did quite significant scholarly work. The first Baha'i communities in Russia were organized after the Bolshevik Revolution, existed for only a few years. There was a local spiritual assembly in Moscow until 1929, and then by orders of government it was closed. And since that assembly used to meet in our home, we had a stamp of the local spiritual assembly of Moscow. And when there was no more assembly, but the stamp was there, I stamped my children's books with the stamp of the spiritual assembly. Unfortunately, that stamp was lost somewhere. Otherwise, I would have returned it to the current spiritual assembly of Moscow, because it has been revived. Now, with the collapse of the Soviet regime, it was quite interesting that the faith actually made much more progress among the Russian population than in the areas of Central Asia and the Caucasus that it had penetrated before. So things are very different now. Yes?
Something along those lines. Have I got it right?
Yes, you have.
Could you embellish it or
Yes.
tell it maybe with greater accuracy than I have?
Mr. Furutan was a student at the Moscow Pedagogical Institute. He wanted to be a teacher of children, and he really had a knack with children. They loved him. I myself loved to wrestle with him when I was a little boy. Whenever he came to our house, it was a feast for me because he was always full of fun and would go down on the carpet and I would wrestle with him. He also tells some stories about me that I don't remember, but he says that in 19... One of the stories he tells that in 1929, he came to our house and he saw me running around the room with my arms extended and making noises like an airplane. And he said to me, "What are you doing?" I was 4 years old. And I said, "I am bombing China." Why? Because in 1929, Russia and China got into a dispute and there was some military action on the border. And of course, living in Russia and hearing the Russian side, I decided I was going to throw bombs on China. So now, Mr. Furutan, while studying at the university, at the Pedagogical Institute, was very active as a Baha'i. And his activity went beyond the bounds of toleration of the Soviet government. And so one day, they just told him to leave the country. And that's when he went to Iran. And Shoghi Effendi indeed told him that he would return to Russia. And he did return at the election of the National Spiritual Assembly of what was then still the Soviet Union. And it was a delight for me to be in the audience and to see Mr. Furutan on the stage, having come back after all those years. So your story was in all essentials correct.
The Guardian isn't often wrong, is he?
Well, I would like to know the instances in which he was wrong. Yes?
Would you have a personal story?
You know, I have said repeatedly that I don't philosophize about such things in application to myself. I must be a very simple-minded person that way. I'm a Baha'i. I believe in Bahá'u'lláh. I do not claim, and I would not believe anybody's claim, to have lived up to his principles, to be an embodiment of his qualities. Only one such person, that was Abdul Baha. I try my best. Now, it has to be, if one sort of stepped back, it has to be that spirit in some form has done something in my life. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here, right? I'm an old man. I'm 73 years old, and I have been at it since I was a boy. What is it? It isn't just ideals. All right, unity of mankind, equality of races. These are wonderful things, but they don't seem to have the same kind of compulsory power for everybody. So what has been driving me and every other Baha'i to engage in these activities? This is where the spirit determines action. Now, exactly how it does, I don't know, and I don't really want to speculate about it. I'm a soldier. I take my commands and I try to do it.
What you were saying about it.
Yes, indeed, indeed. You see, this is why Baha'u'lláh prohibits asceticism. This is why he tells the monks and the priests, stop ringing your bells, get out of your monasteries. Because a religion can become an abstraction, and it's an easy way out. There are sects or groups that think that preventing evil by incapacitating yourself to evil is somehow good. There was a great Russian writer, Leo Tolstoy, who was approached by members of a Russian sect, the Skoptsy, the castrati. These members of that sect would castrate themselves so that they would not sin. And they invited him to join them and thus to become pure. They called themselves white doves because they never committed any act which would be, against morality, against the will of God. Tolstoy wrote to them and he said, But what is the merit of not doing something that you cannot do anyway? You see, what is the merit? If you isolate me in a room and never let me out, and I have never beaten anybody, I have never stolen anything, well, of course, I was locked up in a room. That's what we do to people when they put them in jail, to prevent them from doing bad things. Therefore, a religion that puts you into a monastic cell, yes, it helps you because you don't do bad things, but this is because you incapacitate yourself to doing bad things. Or again, as some of the early Eastern Christian saints, Saint Simeon, who climbs on a column and he stands there forever after. Well, I mean, that's a trick. And they love that in America, you know, pole sitters and people like that, without any religious motivation. But what does that prove? You know, to what does that connect? The Baha'i faith is very different that way. It infuses you with divine spirit, and then it says, go out into the world and create the kingdom of God on earth.
Friends, I omitted to mention in the introduction that Professor Kazemzadeh met the Guardian. So I would like now to set up a shill at one of his talks during the week, to be sure to ask him to tell us about that experience. It's a privilege for us to have these people. We may not have met most of us apart from these two over here who've met somebody who's met Bahá'u'lláh, but there are people still alive who have met the Guardian. And I would just like to say that I don't know how many of the Irish friends are aware that Mrs. Ghodsi, and I think her husband, Mr. Ghodsi, used to tend dawn prayers in the temple in Ishkabad as children. So please, please seek them out and ask them these stories, and be firm with Mrs. Ghodsi, and have a tape recorder hidden in your pocket and try and get it on tape for our children who may not hear it from her. Friends, on your behalf, I would like to very much express our gratitude to Professor Kazemzadeh, and say that in Irish, I don't know if you've heard of the term a shanachi. It's is it the old person? A storyteller, pardon? A chancer, right? And these storytellers, shanachis, stroke chancers were very much treasured in our Irish culture and tradition. They would travel around. They would go initially to houses and cottages. Of late, I suppose they go to the pubs. And they would recount the legends and all the old stories. And I think we could really designate you as an honorary shanachi on your very first visit here. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.